Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for what I guarantee is going to be a really great discussion. My name is Jessica Cork. I'm chair of the Japan America Society of Georgia. And first, I'd like to thank the Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts, the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, and the Center for International Business Education and Research at Georgia Tech. And now it is my very great pleasure to introduce to you my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Brian Woodall from the School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. Dr. Woodall received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, and prior to joining Georgia Tech's faculty, he held full-time faculty positions at the University of California at Irvine and Harvard University. He's held visiting appointments at the University of Tokyo, Tokyo Institute of Technology, Tohoku University, and Kobe University. And Dr. Woodall is also the author of several books on Japanese politics and has been interviewed on various media outlets, including CNN, Bloomberg, Business Week, and the Asahi Shimbun. And his research and teaching utilize the tools of comparative institutional analysis to illuminate a range of sustainable development-related issues, including energy security and environmental stewardship, social equity, mega-region sustainability, disaster resilience, and critical infrastructure protection. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Brian Woodall.
Thank you, Jessica, and thanks to Yoshi and the Japan American Society of Georgia for making this possible. It's a pleasure to do this, and it's also a pleasure to get to work with old friends. And what I'll try to do now is to take you through a kind of, well, actually, Jessica asked me to give a primer on Japanese politics to kind of set this in context. And what I'll talk about first is the Diet and election systems. We'll talk about the Diet. We'll talk about Japan's election systems rather briefly. We'll talk then about the major political parties in the context of the political system. We'll focus on the 2021 election results, and then we'll talk about the Prime Minister and his cabinet and engage in Q&A at the end. Diet and elections. Japan has a bicameral diet. They call it that because, well, really that they adopted some of these institutions from Prussia many years ago. And Japan has a bicameral diet. In Japanese, called a kokkai, composed of two houses, a House of Councilors, which is called the upper house, a House of Representatives, which is called the lower house. Okay, so the Diet is elected, these two houses of the Diet are elected by different electoral systems, and I'll just talk briefly about the one that elects the lower house, the House of Representatives, which just held an election on October 31st. And Japan has what's called a parallel system, a mixed system, and what it does is there are two different voters cast two votes, one for a candidate and one for a party. And so it mixes so-called first past the post in single member districts, FPTP in the acronym, which is very similar to how it works in this country when we elect members of Congress and the Senate and such. But the Japanese system also has a separate party list proportional representation system. So voters also vote for a party. So it's a kind of a strange combination that produces this election system. And so there it is. The system was created back in 1994. The minimum voting age since 2017 has been 18. And so the system works like this. Candidates have to be at least 25 to run for office. They're elected to a 4-year term, but since it's a parliamentary system, the Diet can be dissolved at any time. And in practice, most Diets last only about 3 years. And so it doesn't go the full term. Number of seats are 465. Of them, 289 are single member districts, and 176 seats are allocated in proportional representation according to 11 regional blocks. So that's the nature of the system. We'll talk now about political parties. And to do that, let's put it in the context first of different types of party systems. Japan has a predominant party system. I'll talk more about that in just a second, but let's put that in context. Some countries, for example, China is de facto a single party system. Others, some of the European countries and Israel and elsewhere, have multi-party systems of varying different degrees. The US, we have a two-party system that used to be called Tweedledee and Tweedledum because the parties were so similar to one another that it didn't really matter which one was holding office, although I don't think that's true now. But Japan has a predominant party system. And what this means is that Japan is a country with free and fair elections, and there's plenty of empirical evidence to bear that out. But yet, even though you have these free and fair elections, over and over again, one party emerges as dominant. So in the case of Japan, it's been the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, which for almost the entirety of the period from 1955 when it was founded until today has wielded a majority of seats in the lower house of the Diet and often the upper house too. And so this is what a predominant party in power looks like. And you can see from 1950, well, the first election held after the creation of the LDP was in 1958. From then, right up until today, with two brief exceptions, the LDP has been the party in power. And those exceptions occurred in 1993, August. And from then until, I believe, April or May of the following year, the LDP was out of power, but it came back in the spring of 1994, and has been the part. And then from 2009 to 2012, it was basically in the opposition with the Democratic Party of Japan, the DPJ, calling the shots. So that's what a predominant party system looks like in practice. And these are the major parties. The governing coalition includes the Liberal Democratic Party plus the Kōmeito. The opposition camp is composed of a number of parties, the largest of which was, but may not be for long, the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, which didn't do well in the October elections. The party that did do well, the Japan Restoration Party, also known as the Japan Innovation Party, is another. And then there's the Japan Communist Party. But there, of course, are other parties beyond those. But what we're really talking about is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You've got the LDP, this predominant party that's ruled the roost since pretty much for the entire period since 1955, with two brief exceptions, and then these other much smaller parties. And so the LDP, the party in power, is, despite its name, it's not liberal. It is, in fact, conservative. Some people argue it's not democratic or a party either. We can get into why that is if you want to know. But it's conservative, it's nationalistic. It's also traditionalistic. It supports traditional values, the traditional family and social structure. It has from the very outset been a business-first party, very pro-management, especially big business. Part of that is it's no fan of renewable energy. And in fact, Prime Minister Kishida in Glasgow made it pretty clear that Japan was going to continue burning coal. It's pro-rearmament. In other words, the party would like to see Article 9 of the Constitution revised. And it's mostly pro-US. These trade disputes haven't been so pronounced except for some what I call Trump tremors over the course of the period from 2016 to 2020. But for the most part, the party is pro-US, and you can see that in the so-called Quad setup, Japan, the US, Australia, and India. Japan is a willing partner in that. And just another quick slide to show that these are the prime ministers of Japan, excluding the current prime minister, Kishida. And so you'll see that almost every one of those, from 1955 all the way up until, Prime Minister Suga, who left office in October, have been LDP prime ministers. So 91% of them over the course of that time have been LDP members, LDP leaders. For the most part, LDP presidents. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And 3 of the 6 who were not LDP members at the time are former LDPers. So that's another kind of example of what a predominant party looks like. The LDP's coalition partner is the Kōmeito, sometimes translated to mean Clean Government Party. The leader is Yamaguchi Natsuo, and there he is photographed with Prime Minister Kishida. The Kōmeito and the LDP have been coalition partners for a number of years. they have some divergences in policy, but they're able to get along well enough to govern together. And typically the Kōmeito has at least one, usually only one, member of the cabinet. So one of the perks of being a member of the coalition is they get to have a member of the cabinet, which in the days of LDP, the LDP rule earlier on was not something that happened almost ever. So that's part of it for the Kōmeito. Then there's the loyal opposition. I think loyal might not be the correct term to use here. The party that was pre-October 31st, thought to be the biggest threat to push the LDP aside was the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan under its leader, Edano Yukio. As we'll see in a minute, the party did not do well in the election. And in fact, Edano has stepped down. The party that did well, the Japan Restoration, or sometimes called the Japan Innovation Party, led by Osaka Prefectural Governor Matsui Ichiro, gained a number of seats, but it remains a small party. It is a conservative opposition party, unlike the others. And so this party actually supports revision of Article 9 of the Constitution, which could be interesting, but the party leaders are saying they have no intention of forming a coalition with the LDP. So we'll have to see how that plays out. And then there's the Japan Communist Party, sometimes known as the lovable Communist Party. It was not lovable in the 50s and much of the 60s, but in recent decades it has been. The party, actually one of the things that worked against the Constitutional Democratic Party was its decision to collaborate with the Japan Communist Party and other parties in sponsoring candidates at the local levels. There was some pushback against that. Now we're talking about the 2021 general election. The ball started rolling on this one, or the dominoes started falling when in October, Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide stepped aside. So he announced his resignation, or his intention to not run for the presidency of the LDP on the 3rd of October, 2021. And so we had a scrum within the LDP to replace him. And 4 candidates emerged as the front runners. Kono Taro, who had served in various positions, but he was the vaccine czar for Japan and actually won some kudos for that. A kind of progressive member of the LDP. Then there was Kishida Fumio, kind of a stalwart conservative LDP leader. And then 2 women. And this is the first time, I believe, ever that 2 women made it to the forefront of LDP politics. And those women were Takaichi Sanae, former cabinet minister, a hardcore conservative. She actually made her mark by buying into the hardcore conservative line. And so you can think of her that way, as a very hardcore conservative who was endorsed by former Prime Minister Abe. And finally, there was Noda Seiko, herself also a former cabinet minister, but she was a bit more progressive, not quite a bit more progressive actually than Takaichi-san. And so those are the 4. But the winner turned out to be this guy, currently Prime Minister Kishida Fumio. So he becomes president of the LDP. So that's something that we, I think, in this country don't appreciate completely like we should when it comes to Japan. There are two different things go on here. Becoming president of the party, and since the party is the predominant party in the Diet, he is automatically, essentially, going to become prime minister. And that's exactly what it was. To become LDP prime minister, you must be nominated by at least 20 LDP members of parliament. There's a first round of voting in which each member of the LDP in parliament, in the Diet, gets a vote, plus rank and file get votes on a more or less proportional basis. So it's pretty equal in the first round between the LDP members of parliament, the Diet members, and the rank and file. If no one gets an absolute majority, it goes to a second round. And this is exactly what happened in this past election for the LDP president. In the second round, though, the LDP members of parliament each get one vote, but the rank and file is restricted to one vote per prefectural chapter, which means they only get 47 votes because there are only 47 prefectures, which weights it disproportionately in favor of members of parliament. And at the end of the day, party leaders are the ones that are going to decide. And so this is how Kishida became prime minister. So this is the timeline. You get Prime Minister Suga announcing he'll not seek re-election. The scrum ensues. Kishida is elected on the 29th of September. He forms a cabinet on the 4th of October and calls for general elections that are going to be set for October 31st. He dissolves the Diet on the 14th of October, and the elections are held on the 31st. So the campaign in Japan is short and sweet. I think in some ways I wish ours could be so short and sweet in this country. 12 days only, no door-to-door canvassing. Candidates get equal free ad space and time on TV. You can see the campaign posters in the top of the screen there, that slide. Strict regulations on the number of offices, vehicles, the so-called sound trucks, which those of us who spend much time in Japan, especially during elections, might not like so much. They can be kind of obnoxious. There are also restrictions on wages paid to campaign workers. Vote buying is strictly prohibited, although former Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry Minister Obuchi Yuko got in trouble for stepping over the line on that one by distributing wine to her followers that had a photograph of her on the bottle. Not a good idea. And subsidies to parties are provided by the national government, and there's strict limits on political donations to candidates. So these are the results of the 2021 general election. You can see here that the LDP and its coalition partner, the Kōmeito, emerged with 293 seats. We'll see in the next slide how that changed from previously. And the party that finished with the second most seats was the Constitutional Democratic Party with 96. The Japan Communist Party had 10. The Japan Innovation Party with 41. And so there you go. The LDP actually lost seats in the election. Pre-election, it held 276 lower house seats, and it dropped to just 261. The Kōmeito, its coalition partner, actually did better, going from 29 to 32. But the Constitutional Democratic Party, the main opposition party, did not do well at all, dropping from 110 seats down to 96. The Japan Innovation Party, on the other hand, increased its share of seats from 11 to 41. And finally, the Japan Communist Party dropped a couple seats from 12 to 10. So what this tells us is that the LDP and the Kōmeito have a comfortable majority in the lower house, but not 2/3. So 2/3 would be the number that it would take to revise the Constitution, for example. But they're comfortable, although in a somewhat weaker position than they were pre-election. So now we're to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. I'll talk just a bit about this guy, Prime Minister Kishida. Born in Tokyo in 1957. Now that's significant because he is what we call a third-generation politician, or a hereditary member of parliament. His father and grandfather were both lower house members of parliament. And he, in fact, attended elementary school in the US. And let me just sort of back up just a second. The fact that he was born in Tokyo rather than in the district he represents, which is Hiroshima, is significant. He spent most of his life living places other than the district that he represents, which is very common for these so-called second and third generation politicians. He attended Waseda University, one of Japan's top private schools. He spent a few years working for the Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan, and in 1996, he inherited his seat in the Diet from his father. And since then, he's been elected 10 times. He held some minor cabinet positions, and then he served as Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. And he served most recently as the chair of the LDP's Policy Affairs Research Council. That's a very important position within the party, and it's a way of kind of establishing his footprint and building connections to leaders within the party. That's what he came from, and he's now obviously LDP president and prime minister. His two big accomplishments as the things he's most famous for as from his time as foreign minister was negotiating with the South Korean government. There he is pictured with former ROK President Park. He negotiated a settlement. It hasn't proved too successful about the comfort women. And because he was foreign minister at the time and also from Hiroshima, he accompanied President Obama and Prime Minister Abe when President Obama visited Hiroshima in 2016. So this is his cabinet. It's the second Kishida cabinet because he formed one as soon as he became prime minister, but the election was held after, so he reorganized it in a minor way after the election. But it's composed of 21 ministers, 20 of whom are LDP members of the Diet, one of whom is a member of the Kōmeito, or the Clean Government Party, the coalition partner. 18 of these members are members of the lower house. That's typically the way it works. They've been in the Diet for an average of 7 terms. So figure the terms last about, lower house term, about 3 years. So you're talking about roughly 20 to 21 years. So to become a cabinet minister, it takes that long. It's something you have to start early, and that's one of the reasons why there's so many hereditary politicians are in the game. House of Councilors, there are 3 of those. Average number of terms is 3 years. They're elected to 6-year terms, so it's a different system that way. 18 of these cabinet ministers, 86% are men. In an LDP cabinet, that's the way it works. It's very typical. 3 women. Average age for the ministers is 61.5. And so you figure they've been in politics for 20 years or more in many cases. So they got into politics in their late 30s or early 40s. 13 of them are first-time members. So it's a bit of an infusion of new blood. And there's the cabinet. Some more data if you wish. Names and party affiliations, age, gender, the House of the Diet, they represent the number of terms. Some takeaways here. The positions denoted with yellow stars or gold, whatever color that is, those are the really choice cabinet positions, the ones that everybody lusts after, that they want. And if you note, they all went to people of some seniority, except the industry portfolio, that's the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, went to someone with only 6 terms. That's a little bit surprising. The others are very senior legislators. And the other takeaway here is the 3 female members of the cabinet didn't get any of those positions. This is another very typical story when it comes to handing out cabinet positions. It's said that a lot of them female cabinet ministers get portfolios with feminine characteristics. And with that, I'll stop talking, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions. And again, thanks for having me. And this is actually I have fun doing this kind of thing.
Thank you so much. That was really great. I learned a lot from that. It's been a while since I'd taken a class, in Japanese politics, and then there's definitely been some changes since then as well. So I would definitely invite anyone who is participating, if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat box, and we will go through those. But I'm going to start us off with a couple of things. I don't know, some of my takeaways was, first of all, just amazement on how fast the election process is. I mean, 12 days, I just can't even imagine such a thing. And also, how quickly that you can go from, having one prime minister and then go into an election and then having another one is kind of mind-boggling for an American. But, and I also do remember being in Japan, and when I was living there, being really surprised to get in the mail a little newspaper that had all of the candidates with, their photos and their very succinct, easy to understand platform, all in one place. You didn't have to hunt around like you do here in the US. So that was also something as an American that was really surprising. But I did want to ask a little bit about going a little bit deeper into the current political climate in Japan. So what are some of the key issues. I know you touched on some of them in your presentation, but can you add anything else? Or like, what will Prime Minister Kishida be expected to focus on as key things?
All right, good question. I'll give my take on this. I can think of at least five. One, obviously, is the COVID thing. The Japanese are suffering from COVID fatigue. They'd love to see, and the Japanese have done much better after kind of a clunky rollout for the vaccination program that we all got to see in real time when the Olympics came along and things were not going well. They are now, and Japan's now one of the, in terms of advanced industrialized countries, one of the most vaccinated. I think 75% of the Japanese population is vaccinated, but the people are tired of living under restrictions and they'd love to see change. So that's one thing he's definitely going to have to address. The economy has been sluggish for a number of years, really since the so-called bubble economy burst, the Babaru Keizai, back in the late 80s and early 90s. It's been sluggish, sometimes doing better than others, but never doing just gangbusters. So that's another issue. A big issue for the Japanese, and something that Prime Minister Kishida will definitely have to address, is the expanding gap between rich and poor. Still nothing compared to what we have in this country, but from a Japanese perspective, the gap is widening, and it's a cause for concern. And that's part of what Prime Minister Kishida is talking about with regard to his new form of Japanese capitalism that I'm happy to talk more about if you wish. Other issues, the aging population plus the declining birth rate, I call that Japan's depopulation bomb, poses lots of problems. There are questions about immigration. There have been efforts in recent years to bring more immigrants in and put them in positions, mostly low-tech positions in Japanese industry, but what to do about that. And finally, there's this whole issue of gender inequality. Japan and the Japanese are usually very sensitive to international criticism. And one area in which they've gotten some, and I think well-deserved criticism in recent years, is they're at the bottom of the OECD when it comes to women, especially in politics, but in business and other walks of life. And you see it clearly in the sort of the fact that only 3 cabinet ministers are female. Only 20 members of the LDP are female. So it's something that needs to be addressed. But those are several. I think we could think of others, but those are some that jump to mind.
Great. I actually have so many questions about so many things that you just said, but you did mention about, I think it was the majority, did you say 60% of the cabinet are, relatively new? So this like kind of new, will there be any changes because of that so-called new blood, or is it going to be just, business as usual?
All right, I'll give a quick answer and then I'll back up and qualify it. I doubt that it'll bring much change. A lot of the younger first-time cabinet ministers have close ties to old-style conservative leaders like Abe Shinzo or Aso Taro. So I don't expect to see much there, but it is possible. I've seen it happen a few times where a prime minister comes in and surprises us. I don't anticipate it with Prime Minister Kishida, and I don't see much surprise in the cabinet, but it's possible that I'm wrong. Could be.
Okay, and we did have a question from the audience. Just thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. Japan has a notoriously low voter turnout rate. Do you have any theories about why this is? And do you have any ideas for solutions to increase voter turnout?
Yeah, it's a problem. I think in this past general election, October 31st, the turnout rate was 55%, which, well, unfortunately, it's not terrible by international standards, but by Japanese standards 20, 30 years ago, the rate was closer to 75%. So it's a drop off. The one thing that I can say about it is that in this case, in this issue, in this realm, the Japanese are behaving much like voters in other advanced industrialized countries where the turnout rates come down. Countries like Australia, where voting's mandatory, and if you don't do it, you get fined, they get a high turnout. Japan doesn't. So the answer to that, I really don't know. I think it's a it's a problem that affects many advanced democracies. So the solution is probably similar elsewhere. I think one thing that will not help voter turnout is the fact that, well, okay, someone like Prime Minister Kishida became LDP president and then prime minister. He's considered kind of lackluster, and he was the choice of the party leaders, not necessarily someone that was going to engage the masses. So until the LDP starts putting forward candidates who really appealed for prime minister and also in the districts, they're just not going to get widespread enthusiasm, I would argue.
Kind of following on that a little bit, yeah, it was my understanding kind of in reading as the election was going on that Taro Kono was a little bit more kind of charismatic or also really social media savvy. You know, I'm following him on Twitter and he's tweeting all the time, et cetera. So why do you think that ultimately the choice was to go with the safer, you know, I think that probably safer option there, but why exactly, you know, is that just the way things tend to be in Japanese politics? We're going to take the safe route.
Well, you're right, yeah. Jessica. It's the way things are. It's almost always that way. The only times that someone who's maybe a little charismatic or a little bit out of the ordinary becomes prime minister is almost always a time when the LDP is embroiled in scandal and nobody else wants the job. So I'm thinking back historically, Kaifu Toshiki in the end of the late 80s, he became prime minister. He was the leader of a very small faction, and basically there was nobody else to run against him. All the senior leaders were embroiled in scandal, and so he got the job for that reason. More recently, Koizumi Junichiro in the early 2000s, he tried to become prime minister, party president or prime minister many times and failed. But again, there was just nobody willing to pick up the ball and run with it. And so he did. In the case of Prime Minister Kishida, he was the safe choice. The party leaders believed that, well, he wasn't likely to rock the boat because he's a pretty loyal, you know, member of the party and not known for outrageous remarks or progressive thoughts, the things that that Kono Taro is well known for. So I just think from the perspective of the party leaders and also the business community, I don't think we should poo-poo the strength of the business community in making these sorts of decisions, especially big business like Keidanren. I'm sure they prefer a prime minister who's not going to rock the boat. So that's where I see that coming from.
Right. Well, I'd also like to ask a little bit more about this idea that he has promised, Prime Minister Kishida has promised to introduce a new Japanese form of capitalism. And he was saying it's supposed to address the needs of Japanese households. So can you tell us a little bit, what does he mean by that, new capitalism?
Well, that's a good question. And I'm not sure that he himself could answer it. His utterances have been pretty vague, in my opinion. To the best of my knowledge, what he's really talking about is redistributing wealth is kind of the heart of it. So this doing something about the expanding gap between rich and poor is, I think, the main focus of what he means by this new Japanese form of capitalism, a kind of a kind and friendly version of capitalism. He's promised to raise the capital gains tax, which has actually angered the business community a bit. He's promised 100,000 yen, which is roughly $1,000 in today's exchange rate, to families with children for each child under the age of 18. So it's a way of distributing money to families that might be in need, and assistance for small business. So as near as I can tell, what it's about is trying to do something about redistributing income and addressing this sort of expanding gap. It's not clear that will all work. And even the 100,000 yen per 18-year-old child and younger, they tried something a little bit similar to this assistance program under Prime Minister Abe. And the idea was to get people to spend the money rather than put it in the bank. But of course, in the middle of a pandemic, when you can't go out to restaurants and do that kind of thing, what do? Put it in the bank. The hope here is that they'll spend it and it'll benefit everyone. He's also talking about starting the new, what's it called? The Travel Go program in Japan to get the tourism industry up and running. But I think one of the problems of this idea is has not been clearly articulated. And in fact, one of the criticisms I would kind of level on the Kishida administration is it's not clear exactly what the plan is. It would be very useful to have them flesh something out and make it clearer for all of us, so people like me don't have to try and figure out what this new kind of capitalism is, so it's really clear. But that's as best I can tell, that's what it's about.
I've also been noticing in just various articles that I've been following and other sources, a lot more discussion recently too on this idea of stakeholder capitalism. The Economist, did a big story on that, and then there's been quite a few Japanese companies who, have been following this actually for decades, like the Sampo-yoshi model of like the triple bottom line. And I do wonder how that, what the business community, how that could weigh into this idea of trying to reduce some of these inequities, in society. If you have any, comment on that, or I hadn't heard those terms being spoken of until probably a year ago, even though Japanese companies have been doing it for a long time.
Right. It's a new thing. I didn't hear much of that in the campaign, so that would be a sort of cause for wondering whether it's actually going to be acted upon in any way. That could be a real, depending upon what's meant by the stakeholder shareholder capitalism idea, that could be a real game changer if it goes somewhere. But I think that has to be part of a bigger plan that's clearly articulated and forcefully led, and it would require the business community to really lock arms and assist in making that happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we also have another question from the audience. Why is the one-party situation lasting so long? Is the party doing a great job to deserve it? Do they deserve being in power?
Well, I think you could get different answers to that question. If you ask the folks at the LDP headquarters in Nagata-cho, where I've been many times, they would tell you that, sure, it's because the LDP is doing such a great job. And I guess in fairness, Japan got where it is as the world's third biggest economy, one of the most freest, most democratic, wealthiest economies on earth, countries on earth, under the leadership of the LDP. So whether the LDP, it's by default or by what it did to make this happen, it can take credit for that. And I think people, typically, Japanese people, I think, are quite conservative by nature, and particularly rural voters. The LDP won a real solid constituency in the countryside years ago. It's actually weakened somewhat over time. But so yes, the party is the party. The LDP presided over the Japanese economic miracle, and actually some major changes in democracy too. So it deserves credit there. On the other hand, one of the greatest blessings that the LDP has is what they call in Japanese the damena yato, the no good opposition parties. And it's not that they're bad people or they have bad policies. They just don't articulate a clear strategy. The LDP is often able to co-opt issues that the opposition parties put forward. They're seldom able to work together. And so one of the reasons why the LDP keeps ruling year after year after year is there's nobody to really oppose it. The only time since the party's formation that a party came along that really did in a serious way was back in 2009, when the Democratic Party of Japan actually upstaged the LDP and held power for 3 years. So yeah, I think that the answer to that question, which is a really good one, is that the party's done a lot, deserves a lot of credit. At the same time, it's been lucky because it hasn't really faced a unified or really even a very, in many cases, competent opposition.
Okay. Another question from the audience. The previous prime ministers and the US president have had a unique relationship. So how do you characterize Prime Minister Kishida's relationship with President Biden?
That's a good question. So let's think about that for a second. So the last president, President Trump, had a close personal relationship, we're told, with Prime Minister Abe. So they called it the Shinzo-Donald relationship. Isn't that what it was? Something like that. I never liked the sound of that too much, but historically, the most famous, I think, would be the relationship between President Ronald Reagan and Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro, which was called the Ron-Yasu relationship. The Japanese loved that because, first of all, it's the nickname of both people, right? Both the president and the prime minister. Ronald Reagan is Ron, and Yasu is Yasuhiro Nakasone. It's not clear to me. Okay, so here we have Fumio and Joe. Joe and Fumio, well, kind of has a ring to it. That might work. They met briefly and bumped elbows in Glasgow. I'm sure they have a relationship dating back to Biden's time as vice president. So I'm sure they've met many times and probably know each other pretty well. The Kishida and his people didn't have the same advantage that Trump and his did of being able to sort of go visit Trump Tower and talk to the president-elect before anybody else did. And that actually got them in, not the Japanese, but Trump and his people in some trouble. In answer to the question, I think there's no reason to think there's any animosity. Kishida's been a foreign minister. Biden's well known to be a compassionate and a pretty easy guy to get along with. I would think there's no reason why it shouldn't be a good relationship, but whether it'll be quite as lovey-dovey as the Ron-Yasu relationship and some of these others, we'll have to see.
All right, great. Another question from the audience. You mentioned that the LDP is arguably not liberal, not democratic, nor even a party. So can you tell us a little bit more what you mean by that?
Let me thank the person who gave that question. That's a good one for me. All right. Well, it's not liberal because it's conservative. That's an easy one. Democratic has to do with the sort of procedures of the LDP. I think that's the most dubious of these three letters in the acronym LDP. So that's where that comes from. The LDP, from the very beginning, was a party of factions, not necessarily a single party. So the party formed in November of 1955 by the merger of, guess which parties? Liberal and Democratic parties came together to form the LDP. They brought with them factional leaders within each of those two parties. And from the very beginning, the LDP has been a party of factions. So you could argue it's called a confederation of factions rather than a single political party. There's a lot of truth to that. So, and even now, it was one of the things that the reforms of 1994 were supposed to do was they were supposed to eliminate factions. Well, that didn't happen. So a lot of the people who got positions in the Abe cabinet got them because they're representatives of the factions. So that's where that comes from. It's not liberal because it's conservative. It's not democratic because it embraces some internal politics or policies that are not necessarily democratic. I think, again, that's the weakest of the three letters. And it's not a party because it's a confederation of factions. Probably way more than you wanted to know about the history of the LDP and politics. But that's the backstory.
All right, great. I would like to touch a bit on this, I guess, women in politics issue as well. So, of course, being female, I was excited to see the two female candidates. But, first of all, I would like to know, what you feel that if there is any significance to the fact that there were two women there. But also, I did hear some speculation that there were two because they ended up being sort of pitted against each other, and therefore neither was going to win, and whether or not that's true as well.
Well, that last point, Jessica, is probably the conspiracy theory, and it may be true. I don't know for sure. I believe this is the first time that two females have contested for the LDP presidency and therefore prime ministership. So it is significant in that sense. But if you put it into context, only 20 LDP members of parliament are female. That's pitifully low. That's less than 10%. And this is after Prime Minister Abe, who was prime minister from 2012 until 2020, pushed this so-called womenomics platform, wanted to give women the opportunity to shine, is what he said. And one of those ways, presumably, would be in holding cabinet positions and well, even getting elected to the Diet. And the LDP has in practice embraced the idea of, I think, getting 30% of its candidates from the ranks of female politicians, but it hasn't lived up to that. So the LDP, I think, is I could be wrong about this, but I believe of all the Japanese parties, the primary laggard, hasn't really stepped forward. But that said, the fact that two women contested, whether or not they were being pitted against each other to cancel each other out, and they were kind of the polar opposites of one another, which is kind of interesting. I would think, and again, I'm not female, so I have no probably right to think this way, but if I were, I don't think I necessarily want someone like Takaichi Sanae to become the first female prime minister of Japan. She's made a point of not, pushing for gender equality. She's made a point of arguing for married women should take the husband's, name and not be able to keep their own. And so she very conservative. And I would think from a female standpoint, she would have been kind of disappointing, even though she would have broken the glass ceiling. There have been a few female leaders historically. Back in the 80s, Doi Takako was head of a party. More recently, Renho was a leader of the Democratic Party of Japan. Current governor Koike Yuriko in Tokyo is a fairly prominent female leader, but there's so few, and especially within the LDP. So that's the troubling thing. The fact that there's so few women to begin with in the LDP, and so few that are senior leaders, that it just makes it really unlikely for them to get a chance to take center stage anytime soon.
Two other questions from the audience. Do you see any time in the near future that Japan will have another Yato prime minister?
Wow. Based upon what we saw as a result of the October 31st election, there's no opposition party in Japan that even should make the LDP worry at all right now. Now, things can change quickly. If there was a major scandal involving the LDP, that could change things and maybe elevate an opposition party. But the fact that the Constitutional Democratic Party, the one that was supposed to be this competitor to the LDP, the fact that it took a hit in the October elections, well, that's not good for the opposition camp. The party that gained ground, the Japan Innovation Party, is a conservative party, and not that that's a problem, but it's still very small. So I don't see anytime soon. I could be wrong, but I don't see anytime soon. Although let me just say that back in 2009, when the LDP lost power, people were, I guess for better or worse, a professional academic. People like me, but not me, I never said it, believed that the LDP was dead and gone. They thought that was it. And they were essentially writing an obituary for the LDP. And obviously that hasn't happened. So, but I'm going to be real surprised if in the near future, a Yato, an opposition party, actually takes power.
Okay, and another question, China is increasing its military pressure on Taiwan, and would the Kishida cabinet's foreign policy towards China change because of it?
Ooh, that's a really good question too. First of all, it's the Kishida cabinet, but I'm glad that turned up saying Kishi there, because Prime Minister Abe, Kishi's predecessor's predecessor, who held power for a very long time, he was the grandson of former Prime Minister Kishi, who actually was a big proponent of Japan, of friendly relations between Japan and Taiwan. And relations between the two countries are still quite sanguine, positive on both sides. In answer to the question, though, Japan is handicapped in the sense that because of Article 9, it can't legally, constitutionally do anything in terms of offensive extension of its military. So the self-defense forces can go overseas in the context of UN peacekeeping operations, but doing something really aggressive toward China, no. So if military pressure leads to military pressure, that puts Japan in a quandary. I think you can expect, and that one of the biggest problems that the Kishida cabinet actually does have is what to do about China. That's, if you think about big kind of foreign policy issues, that's arguably the biggest of all, even though it's not quite the hot button issue like North Korea would be, for example, the hypersonic missile tests that have allegedly been going on. But the Japanese are part of the Quad arrangement with the US, also India, also Australia. And the idea is presumably to sort of contain China. So I would think the Japanese would quietly continue to support Taiwan. Whether they go to the mat for Taiwan in the event of Chinese military aggression, that's another question. I'm not sure, but I think Article 9 would have something to say about that.
Okay, and then I think one more question. You mentioned that Prime Minister Kishida is a third generation politician. So, I'm curious, first of all, why did dynasties like that dominate the political leadership in Japan? But, at the same time, the surprising thing is also the revolving door of prime ministers. So you'd expect, these people that have been in politics for so long to be able to, hold on to power longer or want to hold on to power longer. So those seem kind of opposed to me, but can you talk a little bit about, both of those phenomena?
Good question. I've never had it posed quite that way. It's an interesting way to think about it. First, why these, they call them hereditary politicians in Japanese, or second or third generation politicians. I think there are at least three reasons why they're such a dominant force. And the first one, and probably most important, is they have name brand recognition. So they're born into a political family. So if you're from a district like Prime Minister Kishida's father and grandfather held seats in Hiroshima, and he's an odd case because he himself, I don't know how long he actually lived there. He probably knows the neighborhoods of Tokyo way better than he knows the neighborhoods of his own district. So he's not one of these people who came up from the grassroots. He was born in Tokyo, the son of a politician, the grandson of a politician. But in Hiroshima, in that little district that he represents, he has name brand recognition. And in the old days, Japanese literally had to write the name of the candidate on the ballot. It's much easier to write the name of someone you can remember than someone that you don't. So that'd be one thing. A second related point is because he inherited his father's campaign machine. So to get elected, you need two things. You need votes. To get votes, you need money. So he has this organization to sort of mobilize the vote in the district. And he also has an organization to mobilize money, probably not just in the district. It's probably a nationwide system, but he's got that. And then the third reason is he was socialized for this. He grew up sitting at the dining room table with his father, and his mother could be very political too. I don't know much about her, but very political family. So it was expected that he would do that, and it was also expected that he would inherit his father's seat almost as a family heirloom. I would think, answering the second part of the question, all these people that have been in the revolving door, not one of them wanted to revolve that quickly. So from 2006 to 2012, there were 6 prime ministers, 1 per year. And one of them was Abe Shinzo. He had 1 year as prime minister, and then he was out, and followed by another. And these are the 3 LDP prime ministers are all hereditary politicians, all 1 year types. So that's not something they wanted. It was more of the conditions of the time that made that happen. And it's been a while. Actually, we're back. Maybe we're back. The question is, are we back to the revolving door? Prime Minister Suga lasted 1 year. What will be the case with Prime Minister Kishida? And he might suffer from some of the same problems as Suga did. Prime Minister Suga was thought to be quite uncharismatic and not such a live wire. Well, Prime Minister Kishida suffers from some of the same criticisms. So we'll have to see on that one.
All right. Well, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Waddell. That was really, really interesting. I think we could continue this conversation for quite a long time.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right. I'm going to turn it over to the Executive Director of Japan American Society, Yoshimoto, to close us out.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for such an important topic about Japanese politics and the impact the recent elections in Japan will have on U.S.-Japan relations, and actually Japan's relationship with all of the world too. So I think it's certainly, as Jessica and Dr. Brian Woodall mentioned, a topic that will be continuing for for on and on and on, and perhaps we will have another webinar like this sometime next year too, right? So, but thank you again to Dr. Woodall for joining us and spending time to share your insights about Japanese politics and all that's happening in Japan right now. And a special thank you to Georgia Tech as well. Georgia Tech's Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs that Dr. Woodall is part of. And then also Georgia Tech's Center for International Business, Education, and Research as well for partnering with us today. But thank you again to our wonderful chair and leader, Ms. Jessica Cork, for moderating today's program, and then Dr. Brian Woodall for being part of this wonderful event talking about Japanese politics. And then hopefully we can do this again, perhaps in person next time, next year. I guess this is something that we'll have to continue on and kind of talk through in 2022 and beyond. So, but thank you again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.